I'm very, very grateful to be here. Not only because this is a brilliant book written by someone I'm proud to call a friend, but because we're in a time of such pain. People don't know what to think about what's going on, or they really, really think they know what to think about what's going on, and they're angry. They're angry and they're in pain. And I believe strongly that as a journalist, I suppose, one of the things you do when you're angry and in pain and bewildered is try to illuminate what's going on, to try to make it comprehensible. I think there are a lot of forces in society, the press, uh, various parts of our society now that make doing that increasingly difficult. The stovepiping of media and politics and so on. And I think a gathering like this one is extremely important, not only to discuss this brilliant book, but to raise questions about what we're seeing in front of us every day. So I want to really thank the JCC for doing this. And I want to thank Nathan for being here and for asking me to take part. I'm honored. It's something I feel strongly about and want to be doing. How many people present have looked at this book or read it? Oh, a number. Excellent. Okay. Well, I thought I would begin, with Nathan's permission, by asking him to read an excerpt so that those who haven't yet read it can get an idea of the texture of the book, because the texture itself is quite unique, I think.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for coming. It's my honor to be here with you. So I'm going to read a chapter. The book tells the story of a crash, an accident that takes place outside Jerusalem, and it's a school bus full of Palestinian kindergartners, about 50 of them, who live in an area about 2 miles away from my home in Jerusalem, on the other side of a large gray concrete wall, a 26-foot tall concrete wall. And many of the parents and children in this story are residents of Jerusalem. They share the same city as me. They pay municipal taxes, but they live a radically different existence. They receive almost no municipal services. They are forced to burn trash in the middle of their streets. They have no playgrounds. They have no lanes in their road. And they have to travel through a checkpoint to get to the rest of the city, to their schools and to their jobs. And this book tells the story of a school bus trip that took place within this community. And because the kids on this bus had different kinds of permits, some of them had green IDs, which don't allow them to enter Jerusalem. Some of them have blue IDs, which do allow them to enter Jerusalem. They couldn't go to a nearby play area, for example, one just on the other side of the wall in the settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev. So they followed the circuitous path of the wall and passed through a checkpoint and were struck by a semi-trailer, which was on its way to a settlement quarry to extract stones from the West Bank, which were then used to pave the roads inside Israel. And so I'm going to tell the story of one particular bystander, a doctor named Huda Dahbour, who was on her way with a medical team to a different location and stumbled upon this burning bus and helped to rescue some of these children from the bus. And the part I'm going to tell now is after that rescue is nearly over. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Huda and her staff had come upon the burning bus. Flames and smoke were still pouring from the smashed windows. Huda's driver, Abu Faraj, was directing traffic, keeping an open path for the evacuees and telling drivers of oncoming cars to turn back. The crowd had grown so large that Huda could no longer see the driver and the teacher she and Salam had pulled from the front of the bus. Salam was another bystander who single-handedly rescued dozens of children entering the burning bus to do so. She was focused on the children, gently carrying them with one of the UN nurses to the cars that had stopped at the accident site. Many of the drivers had volunteered to transport the burn victims and stood ready to race to the nearest accessible hospital, which, for most of them, was in Ramallah. The hospitals in Jerusalem were far better, but only those with blue IDs could reach them. A few of the drivers did have blue IDs, and some took off in the direction of the Hadassah Hospital at Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The majority, those with green IDs, went in the opposite direction, along the flooded road to Ramallah. Nearly all the children had been brought off the bus when Salam, who had by now gone in and out of the flames several times, saw that Ula, the teacher and his partner in the rescue, was trapped beneath a front seat and her leg was burning. But by the time he got to her, it was too late. She was gone. He carried Ula from the bus and placed her on the ground. Her nephew, Sadi, watched in the rain while a man covered her with his coat. In all of this, Salam had felt nothing, not even as someone in the crowd grabbed at his arm and pinched him. One of Huda's nurses yelled to him that his jacket was on fire. He shouted back that it was not. The nurse put it out as he went to climb back into the bus. The few children still inside were no longer alive. The last boy Salam pulled out was facing down, crouched behind the frame of a seat. He was still wearing a backpack, which Salam held to pick the boy up. Stepping out of the bus for the final time, Salam broke out weeping, shouting that he should have saved more. Somehow, not a hair on his head was burned. Abu Faraj stood unmoving, in shock, as if mesmerized by the flames. Huda turned to the nurse beside her and saw that her face was black and streaked by rain. She realized she must look the same. They were soaked and bone-weary, and there was nothing more for them to do. When a Palestinian ambulance finally arrived, most of the injured children had already been evacuated. Huda didn't even notice it. The bus was still crackling with flames, and there was much shouting and commotion. Not a single firefighter, police officer, or soldier had come. Huda wanted to follow the children. She found her team, and they returned to the UNRWA van. Nida, the pregnant pharmacist, was still inside, inconsolable. Abu Faraj started dropping off everyone at home as Huda called around and confirmed that most of the children were in Ramallah. Then she phoned her UNRWA supervisor. He didn't understand the magnitude of the accident and demanded that the team turn around and go to Khan al-Ahmar or he would cut their pay. Huda refused and said he should just cut her salary, no one else's. After stopping for a quick shower, Huda set off for the hospital, taking the clinic's social worker with her. When they got there, word spread that Huda had been at the crash. A great many parents and other relatives sought her out, asking whether she had seen a boy with a Spider-Man backpack, a girl with her hair in yellow ribbons. Huda told them all the same thing. The children had been covered in soot, and she couldn't tell what they were wearing. Going from room to room, Huda checked on the injured children, soothing them. Since leaving the bus, she had felt something nagging at her. She was sure the kindergartners had been silent, at least early in their ordeal. Now, at the bed of one girl, Huda asked her why that was, why she had heard no sound. "We were so scared," the girl said. "When we saw the flames, we thought we had died. We thought we were in hell."
How did you meet Huda?
Huda came to me after I had posted on Facebook, on a Facebook page for the community of Anata and Shuafat camp, that I was writing about this accident and wanted to talk to anyone who had any involvement in it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another member of her medical team who came forward, and then through that person, I was put in touch with Huda, and I met her in Ramallah shortly after that, and she's one of the people I actually spent the most time with researching the book.
I begin with that question because this is a very unusual book. I'd call it a nonfiction novel, which is to say it doesn't read immediately like a book of reporting. It reads like a story that a novelist put together, and not simply the texture of the prose, which you just heard in Nathan's reading, but the way point of view and especially narrative placement is used to produce suspense. For example, we don't know what happened to Abed's child until the very end of the book. How did it come to you? I mean, I guess, let me just come out and say it. How did you begin to understand that this was a story you could tell in that kind of a way?
I think that it was largely as a result of having extensive interviews with people like Huda and Abed, who revealed the most intimate details of their lives to me. Mm-hmm. And they were conversations that were much richer and deeper than those I had had in other kinds of reporting. And, the book is called A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, but I do tell, the life story of people like Huda and Abed. And so I simultaneously saw that I both had the level of detail that I would need to tell the story intimately and to really bring out emotion and thought and people's inner lives. And I also felt that in the life story, or at least the family history of some of the characters, I also would be able to achieve this larger ambition, which is through the crash to tell the larger story of Israel-Palestine. Mm-hmm. And that created its own, structurally, that was a very difficult problem to interweave those two narratives.
You mean to interweave the exposition about how people live with the actual story of what happened that day?
Yes. So it was, on the one hand, balancing the need to tell a more or less chronological story of the day of the crash and its aftermath, and to make sure, you can only keep so many people in your head at a time. Mm-hmm. And so to make sure that I was only introducing a person at the most relevant point at which they intersect with this bigger story of the crash. But I also had trade-offs to make, because maybe the real interest of that person is not so much their particular interaction with the crash, but it's their family story or their backstory that illuminates the bigger story of Israel-Palestine. Mm-hmm. And then you had a whole separate timeline. So, Huda, her story is really the story of expulsion and exile. Right. And it's the story of 1948. It's also the story of Oslo and returning to Palestine in Oslo. And so I, Abed's story is largely the story of the First Intifada. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted those to be presented to the extent possible in the right order. You didn't want to introduce 1948 after other events. So structurally, it was a major challenge to balance those things. And of course, my temptation as a writer is to stuff as much as I possibly can into any piece of writing. And in this case, I really had to be disciplined about prioritizing the story of the crash and mm-hmm. keeping to that, because there were elements of the story that were, from the perspective of a history of Israel-Palestine, important So I was very tempted. For example, Huda, it's mentioned, she's on her way to Khan al-Ahmar, which is a community that is actually a Bedouin community that's constantly in the news because it's at risk of expulsion. Israel wants to get rid of this community in the West Bank. It's right next to a settlement. It's an eyesore. And they had been expelled from the Negev in around 1951. And so several years after the founding of the state. This is a story that a lot of people don't know of, thousands who were expelled after 48. And so, again, there I have these temptations to put those things in, which are justifiable for a book that's primarily an Israel-Palestine history, but not justifiable for a book that I really wanted it to be something that someone could read and would be driven to read, to be gripped by the story of the crash.
I have to ask you just a question of craft. Did you chart this out? I mean, the narrative is extremely complex.
Yes, I mean, I didn't literally do like a chart on a wall, but I did do the equivalent.
Yeah. I felt, I don't know, writers are like carpenters, admiring another house. How is that house built? And I found myself frequently throughout this book admiring its construction. Especially artful is the immense amount of exposition that is told through people.
Yeah.
There is no separate history. There's no separate description or background. It is all vitalized through people's lives. And it gives the book a kind of energy and power that history, telling it straight off, simply doesn't have. So I found myself, you're always in a kind of horror. Where am I going to put the exposition in? How am I going to do it? And you found a way to do it in this book that I thought was extremely artful and powerful. Why did these people confide in you in the way they did?
So when I was on tour with Abed for the first several weeks, and he felt that he had to go back home to Anata, the whole West Bank right now feels reminiscent of the Second Intifada. His town was, the two exits were shut down, 130,000 people were trapped in a very small area, and many of these families rely on jobs and settlements and in Israel to survive. Some member of the extended family. And all of those jobs, most of them are not allowing Palestinians to come to work now. There's a huge spike in settler violence. His son works for a Palestinian employer, but was told he can't even go to work in Ramallah because it's too dangerous on the roads from the settler violence. So Abed was with me for the first few weeks, and he was asked this question many times. Why did you trust him? And he revealed things to me that I didn't know, actually, in answering those questions publicly, which was that, in fact, many people around him were asking him that very question as I was spending the time with him. Who is this guy? Why are you spending so much time with him? What are you telling him? Does he work for the Israelis? And so he basically said, I saw Nathan cry with me. We grieved together, and I trusted him right away.
How did that happen?
It was immediate. It's just he really opened himself up to me. The story deeply moved me, and I should say too that it was a bit of a bargain because, or I don't know if the bargain is the right word, but it was there was a risk in how much he opened himself up to me because I had to make a decision as the author whether I was going to share the book with him when it was still in manuscript form, to allow him to look at it, because there really is a lot in there, family secrets that he's never revealed.
Yeah.
And
could you give an example? There's the history of his marriages.
Yeah. One particular example is his sister-in-law ruined his life by lying to him and ruining his 7-year-long relationship with his first love.
Which his sister-in-law knows, by the way, but nobody else does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And so he's never confronted her. He knows that she's lied, and he's never confronted her, and now it's in this book. And there are a number of other examples. His first love, it turns out that she had written a letter to him she got married immediately after they broke up. And the man that she married, she had written to him that he was the guy she hated the most in the entire town. That I don't think has ever been revealed. And so when Abed read the book, I decided not to share the manuscript with him because, I mean, it's almost never done. In this particular case, I had spent so much time with him. His name is in the title. There was part of me that really felt, I was really torn about whether to share it with him. And so I had months of anxiety about how he would react to the book. And in the end, I decided to only share it with him in hardcover. And so as soon as I got a hardcover, the very day it came, in DHL, I went and I handed him a copy. And he called me 2 days later, and he'd only read the first section of the book, which is about all his love life, basically. And he said, I'm really distraught. You have no idea how much trouble I'm going to be in Anata. Like everyone, like I'm in trouble with Fatah, the main political faction. I'm in trouble with, the husband of my first love. I'm in trouble with my sister-in-law. Like everyone's going to come after me. And I said, I hear you. Please finish the book and let's talk. Like I want you to read the rest. I don't know if this will make you feel any better, but the other people revealed worse. And so he finished the book, and he said, I understand what you were doing, and I've come around to accepting this. It's my story. I have a right to tell it, and I'm ready. I'm ready for whoever comes to confront me about it. But in answer to your question, I think that this is one of those cases where being an outsider to the society helped me as a journalist because Palestinian society is so tightly knit. And, if a Palestinian journalist were to come to Abed, he would immediately know how many degrees of separation there are between them, who he may know within his extended family. And he would be very reluctant to tell him the kinds of things that he told me. And I think that was the case with a lot of the people I talked to. A second thing was just there was a cloud of silence in many of these families around the accident because everyone was afraid to upset the bereaved. They were, would try not to discuss the missing child, the accident, and so I found that many of these parents were longing to talk about it. They were yearning to talk about it, and it just came pouring out. And I think that probably more than anything is why I had as much as I did.
I lived on the West Bank in Ramallah for about a year total. And I found the first part of this book absolutely startling and stunning because I don't know, I thought, how did he get this guy to tell him this? Because there are a lot of wives and there are a lot of fast engagements and there are it's a very kind of beautiful story of a crazy love life.
Yeah.
And I was just startled by it because it seemed to reveal to me what had been going on under my nose. I mean, if you want a kind of ethnographic study of how Palestinian families get together and what they do, this book is unsurpassed, I think. The other thing that startled me is that I had always been fascinated by the Kalandia I think I told you this when I was there. I'd always been fascinated by that checkpoint, the Calandia checkpoint, which is just such a bizarre urban space. I mean, it is so strange with the watchtower that's burned and I thought at one point of trying to write something about Calandia. And this book is so much about the weird urban spaces of this very strange part of the world that is intensely populated, but divided in man-made ways in absolutely bizarre fashion. You know, there's no rhyme or reason to it. I think you once, when we were driving, you said to me after we got through Calandia, I think, you said, you know, this section, no one claims this section. This is kind of a no man's land. You see the road, the way the road is, you know, not been repaired. Well, it theoretically, what was it? Theoretically, it's the Israelis.
So it's technically Calandia and the road after you've crossed the checkpoint. You're on the West Bank side of the wall. You are still in municipal Jerusalem.
Right.
So you're in this area where people are paying taxes to the municipality of Jerusalem, according to Israel. They're within the sovereign state of Israel, and they get no services. It's like the town where these people in the book come from. And I think what I pointed out to you is that because, you know, Calandia is in a state of, you know, total neglect, and you go on this, you know, terrible unpaved road, and people are driving the wrong way just to get around the traffic, or the wrong way on a one-way road, and then all of a sudden, about, you know, a couple kilometers up, it becomes very, you know, smooth and well paved and nice, and then there's a big sign to the right of which foreign government paid for it.
Right.
And then what's the answer to why that is? You would think the opposite. The part that's sovereign Israel ought to be the nice part. The shitty part should be the occupied West Bank. But no, because a foreign government, because Israel doesn't care about anything on the other side of the wall that's not a settlement, and the part that is, and a foreign government is not going to pay for occupied East Jerusalem that Israel considers sovereign Israel, and Israel doesn't want to let them either, because they don't want to, and they don't want to let the PA there either. So you have the foreign government starts paving the road exactly where the municipality ends, and you're on your way to Ramallah. Yeah.
And so you've been through this kind of no man's land that nobody claims ownership of. I mean, the complexity of the West Bank and of the way land is divvied up between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, in effect, I have never seen a more, perspicacious analysis of it than in this book. You know, how strange it is. I remember arriving at Ben Gurion Airport, and the fixer I had hired on the way to Ramallah gave me this speech about Area A, Area B, Area C, and I was regretting that I hadn't taped it, because it was this kind of disquisition in insanity. You know, it was right out of Kafka.
Yeah.
And I think this book conveys that, the illogic of it all, so vividly. And at the end of the day, it's at the root of why these children died. You know, the illogic of the arrangements on the ground.
Yes.
And so it's, on the one hand, a book about people in which you have many, many people, particularly the title character, vividly described, and whose life you come to know intimately. But it also turns out at the end, when you get to the end of the book, that it's been this voyage through the illogic and craziness of of how Palestinians live, but also the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yes. Well, I'm honored to hear you say that. Thank you.
That wasn't really a question, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that was the ambition of the book, was to show in fact how this accident, almost everything that transpired on that day, was foreordained and entirely predictable, and you can even find NGO reports predicting these sorts of things happening. I will say, though, about the illogic, I mean, there is also a logic, which is the logic of the character Danny Tirza, who is the architect of the wall and explains why it is routed in exactly the way that it's routed.
Who has a fascinating history as well.
And he has a fascinating history himself, and comes from a secular family. His grandfather was an early Zionist pioneer, grew up in an ultra-Orthodox family like many early Zionists, and was a rebel against his family in moving to Palestine, and most Jews were totally opposed to it. And Danny became religious as a teenager, and he joined the army, and he was involved in every single negotiation with the Palestinians, and is in fact, he's the one who created Area A, B, and C. He made all of those maps. Yasser Arafat famously called him Abu Kharita, which is father of the map. And Danny was sure that what Arafat really meant was Abu Kharta, which is father of bullshit. And so Danny was tasked with creating the wall and creating the whole architecture of it, but also the route of it. Mm-hmm. And he explains in the book how he chose actually the route around the community where these parents and children come from, the Shuafat refugee camp in Anata. And the answer is, very simple. We're not going to follow the municipal boundary. We want to route the wall in a way in which we will take the maximum number of Palestinians and put them on the other side, so that to keep the maximum number outside the heart of the city, while relinquishing the minimum amount of land. And so what you have are places like Kalandia and Kufr Aqab and Anata and Shuafat Camp that are densely populated urban areas right on the other side of the wall.
And they're in Jerusalem.
And they're in municipal Jerusalem. And in fact, what you saw after the wall was created was something bizarre, which was, nobody wants to live on the other side of this wall. The higher paying jobs are in Jerusalem. You don't want your kids to go through a checkpoint every morning and confront soldiers. It's of course much more desirable to be on the Jerusalem side, the Israeli side of the wall. But what happened after the wall was created was that all of these huge towers sprung up on the other side of the wall. Those areas were not as densely populated when the wall was created, and there's a very simple reason why, which is that the prices within the East Jerusalem neighborhoods that are on the Israeli side of the wall, the prices go up. It's more valuable, and all of the people who can't afford to live inside the heart of Jerusalem, they can't move to Bethlehem or Ramallah without risking having their blue ID revoked. Mm-hmm. They have to have
blue ID. Maybe you should.
Sorry, the blue Jerusalem ID, the ID that allows them to enter Jerusalem, to keep jobs in Jerusalem, to live in Jerusalem, and to get Israeli national health insurance. And so what happens is they all start getting cheap apartments on the other side of the wall. Some of them would get 2 apartments. One is just an empty place on the other side of the wall, and then they're actually living in Ramallah or wherever. And then inspectors from the National Insurance Agency come, and they come unannounced, and they check, are you really living in this apartment, in this ghetto on the other side of the wall, and they will and as soon as these drivers come in from the National Insurance Agency, people know who they are, recognize them. They start calling each other and saying that the inspector is here. So everybody rushes back to their apartment. And when they come in, they will come and they will inspect, towels and say, this doesn't really look lived in. This is you're not really living in this place.
God.
And if they're not, then their center of life is not in the city. They'll have their blue ID revoked, the city they were born in.
And so they just pull it.
They'll just pull it, and then they might have family members who live in, the heart of Jerusalem who they can't even see anymore.
There's, a continuing theme in this book about where are the children? Where are they? Where is my child? And if you're a parent, you can imagine how gutting that instinct is. There's been an accident. You have no idea the condition of your child or where your child is. And what determines where you can go, what hospital you can visit to find your child, is the card that you have. So that if you have a green card, for example, you can't go into Jerusalem proper, and you need to find a relative or a friend who has a blue card and can go and look for a blue ID and can go and look for you at Hadassah Hospital or wherever. So there's this kind of embedded problem of who has a right to go where, which is such a dominant thing on the West Bank, becomes this drama within the book.
Yes.
Who can go where?
Yes, yes. And in what you just described is exactly what happened to Abed, who had his green ID, wasn't able to go and look for his child at Jerusalem hospitals, sent a relative with a blue ID to go and look for his son at Jerusalem hospitals.
Mm-hmm. And it takes a very long time to find.
It's over 36 hours before he finds out what happened to his son.
Oh, God, I didn't realize that. 36 hours.
Yeah.
We're going to open this to questions in just a moment, but I could go on asking you questions for hours about this book, but I feel like it's my responsibility as interlocutor here to point out that this book tour has happened during this moment of cataclysm in Israel, in Gaza. And I wonder, have you thought about the implications of the story you tell for what's been going on there now? That's a very vague question,
Yeah.
I know, but
yeah. I mean, I obviously it's a story about the death of children, and that's pretty tragically resonant right now. But beyond that, it's a story about dehumanization,
mm-hmm.
and the dehumanization that, in fact, all of the characters in the book have experienced in some way. A settler paramedic who comes on the scene of this accident far too late. All the kids are gone. He sees these empty these backpacks on the road, burned out shell of a bus, and all he can think about is a horribly dehumanizing experience of picking up body parts from suicide bombings, the time of the flying buses, as he calls it. And after the accident, there were a bunch of Israelis, largely young, who were posting jubilant posts on the comments sections of various news articles and on Facebook without pseudonyms, with their own names, writing how happy they were that these kids had burned to death. And it was so disturbed, this center-left Israeli TV news anchor, that he decided to make a TV special about this in order, in his words, to hold up a mirror to his society. And the title of the special was "An Arab Kid Died, Ha 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 Ha," which was a direct quote from one of the posts. and Abed actually appeared in this special. He interviewed Abed in this special. But I think for me, these last weeks, absorbing this news has been, I mean, it's been a story of dehumanization and brutalization that I think that all of these people have been living with for a long time. We're seeing it on a different scale than we'd seen before, but there was a precedent, and I fear that actually, you know, as horrible and as unprecedented in scale as what we've seen, it feels to me like the beginning of something rather than the end.
The beginning of something.
The beginning of a much darker period.
A much darker period. You know, it's striking that word dehumanization, because one of the takeaways I think from this book is that, you know, nothing is free. You know, if we build these structures, it will have its effect on the people who are subjected to them, but also the people who built them, which is one of the reasons, when I say that, I mean the West Bank and how it's organized now in Gaza. But it's one of the reasons I was grateful you included those quotes from the Israeli teenagers, because it's kind of a demonstration of that. It's like, what are we making of our kids if they can write something like this? Yeah. That it's not free what you do. You know, yes. It has consequences. And it's really, in a way, a kind of brilliant tour de force about consequences.
Thank you.
Well, we have time for some questions. I think we have microphones that are going to be carried around.
Is it on? Okay. Excuse me. I can hold it. Oh, okay. I wanted to thank you for the book. I was just so engrossed by the book. And I have to say, I was kind of sobbing in that last chapter. It's so incredibly powerful. So I have two questions. Firstly, there's this very strong suggestion that the rescue services were closest in the Israeli section. Do you think that if the ambulance service, the fire service, the rescue services had actually activated, I mean, in the book you explain they don't, they ignore the call. And would they have saved the kids? That's my first question. And the second one is that Abed is such a wonderful character. I wish he could have come this evening. I just wonder how he and his wife, Haifa, is it, how they're doing.
Well, thank you for that. You know, to answer the first question, you know, the book is not asserting that anybody deliberately wanted those kids to die. I mean, other than these kids posting on social media or on news sites and rejoicing in the deaths, none of the failed emergency response, the fact that the first Israeli fire truck came after all the kids had been evacuated and more than 30 minutes after the crash. I do share the view, I mean, in the book, I show what many of the parents said and felt, and this is almost a universal feeling among them, was we know that road, and if a Palestinian kid was throwing stones on that road, we've seen it with our own eyes. Within seconds, the Israeli army is there to arrest them, or border police. And the aim of the book was not to kind of place blame on any given unit of the fire department or the police or what have you, but rather to show how this system actually produced this outcome. There have been many other cases where, for example, there was a fire a few years ago in Kufr Aqab, another one of these communities on the other side of the wall, and the fire truck wasn't allowed to go through at Kalandia without an army escort. And the people there were left to fend for themselves and to try and rescue people from this fire, and people died. And there have been many other cases. So this is a story of an area of deliberate neglect with foreseeable tragedies like these coming out of that neglect. And it's also a story of, when you look kind of narrowly at, for example, the delayed police response. I mean, part of the delay was that their, mental topography of this place was the settlements. They only really knew the settlements. That's, their job is to protect Jewish lives in the West Bank, not Palestinian ones. And so when the call came out on dispatch, how was it described, the location of the accident? Inaccurately. They're just an accident at the nearest settlement junction, at Adam Junction, or at the Adam settlement. And so the police went into this settlement looking for the accident site, drove around in circles, exited the wrong way, went toward the Hizma checkpoint, doubled back, and probably lost 10 minutes just because, again, this is not anybody's deliberate, notion of no one's trying to delay their arrival, but the system that's in place creates all of the outcomes that we saw on that day. Now, with respect to Abed and Haifa, it's a really grim situation in the West Bank right now, and that's the reason Abed had to cut his tour short. And so, there are lots of families where the mothers are afraid for their kids to go out, Palestinian mothers in Jerusalem right now, because when they go out, the police are asking to see their cell phones, flipping through the pictures. When they don't see something they when they see something they don't like, arresting them, or in some cases beating them. And meanwhile, these young guys are watching the news on TV. They're seeing what's happening in Gaza. And I know one mother who's sitting at home crying, worried that her son is going to go and commit, suicide by cop. So it's a very bleak situation in the West Bank right now, and there's a huge spike in deaths and in expulsions as well.
Here in front.
Okay, can I stand up? I have not read your book, but I am very, very moved. I have been to Israel 9 different times in my life, and I've read a lot of different books. The most recent that I read was Sadness is a White Bird. I'm wondering if either of you have read that one. It's, when you've described yours, it's very, very similar. Sadness is a White Bird is fiction, but it attempts to show both the terrible tragedy on both sides. There's a book I hope you will read. It's by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. She's famous for Infidel. She has a book from 2015 called Heretics, and it describes, and the subtitle is something like why Islam has never had a reformation as Judaism and Christianity have had a reformation. And it's it's worth reading. So my only hope is all of these organizations that are supported partially by the New Israel Fund. Do you know anything about that? The New Israel Fund?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the New Israel Fund. Yeah.
Is there hope in your heart for that?
Well, I think they support some good organizations, but I don't think, we can rely on these tiny civil society organizations that are representative of this, tiniest sliver of the Israeli population to save us. They do important work, but they're not representative of a social movement, and I think there is this tendency, because the left is in such a sorry state in Israel. Like, that's all there is, are these tiny civil society organizations, and so people want to invest in them and support them, and it's important to do that. But that shouldn't be confused with an actual political strategy. Thank you. I've got water. I'm just something in my throat.
Hi, Nathan. My question is threefold. Well, it's one question, but there's three parts to it. I'm halfway through the book, so I'm just curious in what language you conducted the conversations that you had. Has this book been published in Hebrew? And then when you were writing, who was your audience? Like, who were you thinking of?
So I conducted most of the interviews in English, some in Arabic. The Israeli characters almost entirely in English, and the audience that I had in mind. There has not been a translation in Hebrew or Arabic. They're trying to sell rights in various places. I'm hopeful that that will happen, but no news on that front. And the audience that I had in mind, I think the reason you're asking is it wasn't primarily Israelis or Palestinians. It was Israelis and Palestinians, but it was primarily people who know very little about Israel-Palestine. The ambition of the book was really to tell the whole story to people who might not care, who couldn't even point to Israel-Palestine on a map. And I kind of changed my entire career path, in fact, because I no longer believed in the work that I was doing, which was talking to elites and attempting to shape the views of policymakers, which I think I did succeed actually in doing, but I found is actually entirely useless if there's not a change in public opinion.
I've served on an Israeli army base 3 times as a volunteer. And during that period, I also was a member of Salam Shalom, if you're familiar with it, Muslim and Jewish women joining together to get to know one another and develop relations. I was a member for 3 years in Charlotte, North Carolina, before the Muslim women decided they didn't want to meet with the Jewish women, ended the chapter. Question to you is, what are the chances, do you think, of having a dialogue between Muslims and Jews to try to communicate and realize how much we have in common? And the second question is, to what extent is Netanyahu responsible for where we are now because of his legal issues?
To the first question, I think that, there are a couple of issues. One is a lot of Palestinians don't like this Muslim-Jewish framing. which plays to the notion of it being a religious conflict and 3,000 years old and what have you, rather than being a conflict that began with a political idea of Zionism in 1882 with the first Zionist immigration to Israel. So, there are lots of Palestinian Christians who are as nationalistic as their Muslim counterparts. So I think that there is a real skepticism about this Muslim-Jewish framing, which is also a kind of an Israeli right-wing framing. The whole notion of ancient hatreds, and they just can't accept that we will be here. And so, but there was a second part to your question.
Netanyahu.
Netanyahu. I'm not a fan of Netanyahu, but I don't. I think it's been overstated the degree to which his personality has been blamed for everything in Israeli politics. I think is wildly out of proportion, and I think there's some kind of scapegoating that's going on. The things that I care about have been done by labor governments, Likud governments. All of the settlement construction, the settlement projects started with the left, with labor. So I don't really, I'm not invested in the anti-Bibi fervor. I think that certainly he is trying to get out of the getting convicted, and that's certainly a part of the story. But all of these, protesters who were in the streets a month ago, the rhetoric was as though you would get rid of Netanyahu and everything would change, and I don't think that's true.
I have my own question, just follow up on that. You talked about the disarray of the Israeli left. Were you at all encouraged by the movement to stop this change in the power of the court system, the series of demonstrations and so on? Do you think that represented something new?
I do think it represented something new. I think that there is potential in that movement, and I think it's not over. I think that movement is going to be a very powerful force now when it comes time to blame people like Netanyahu for October 7th. So I think it's terribly important, but I also was very frustrated by the discourse of that group, and again, the scapegoating of settlers when the entire political spectrum, the whole state, the Supreme Court itself that they're trying to save had approved everything, every violation of international law that we see in the West Bank. So there was something hard to swallow about the rhetoric of the democracy protests, and of course the fact is, between the river and the sea, there's one sovereign. And there are 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians, and the vast majority of those Palestinians don't have basic civil rights. And that is not a system, it's lasted for decades, that I think any kind of outside observer would fairly call a democracy. And so all of the rhetoric around democracy, too, to Palestinians seemed absurd.
You make me think of that great documentary, The Law in These Parts, which is very much about how implicated the court system is in Israel and the occupation.
By the way, I don't know why, but it came up just the other day in a talk that I gave, and I said that I recommended it to somebody and said that I think it is the best documentary ever made on the occupation.
Yeah, it's tremendous. The Gatekeepers also, it strikes me as a very good documentary.
It's a good one, but I like The Law in These Parts more.
Let me ask you a final question just to send everybody home optimistic. You said things were going to get darker, you feared.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can expand on that a little and talk about the current situation and where you think it will lead. I know you're not a prophet, but
Yeah.
you know the ground as well as anybody.
Yeah. So the reason I said that I fear that it'll get darker is because for the first time in my life, I can imagine, I mean, this is really your area of expertise, but and I know very little about it, but I can imagine, civil on civil conflict, Balkan style conflict, and that's a frightening proposition, and you see it to some extent already in the West Bank with the settler militias. They've displaced, since the beginning of 2022. Now, and in the last weeks, it's accelerated hugely. But prior to October 7th, it was over 1,100, over 1,000 Palestinians forcibly displaced, mostly by settler militias within the West Bank. And in the last week, it's been hundreds more. And so you have that, but you also have the potential for inside Israel you're seeing little glimmers of it. You saw that there was a giant protest against Palestinians outside of a dorm at Netanya College a few days ago. I know personally stories of like the most, kind of bourgeois communities that are in central Israel, but pretty close to Route 6 and the wall of the West Bank, where I was told of neighbors who are building Molotov cocktails at home out of fear that Palestinians from Kalkilia are going to come over. That is the kind of atmosphere that's in the air right now. I'm sure there will be plenty of revenge attacks against innocents. I'm sure that, if you just look at the wall-to-wall support right now for, the collective punishment of every Gazan for the attack of October 7th. The center-left president of the country, the former head of the Labor Party, there are no innocents in Gaza. So,
Incredible statement.
Yeah. So I think October 7th is a major historical event. I think it will have decades-long consequences for the psyche and social fabric of Israel, and of course, what's happening now in Gaza will do the same for Palestinians. So it just feels like this is all the very early phase of really a lot worse.
Well, I said I wanted to send you out here with an optimistic statement. Actually, I wish this discussion could continue, but for you it can. You can go and purchase a book from Books Inc. and have Nathan sign it and give him your comments about what you've heard tonight. So please do visit the bookseller and support them. It remains for me to thank once again the JCC, to thank all of you for coming out tonight, and to ask you to join me in thanking the author of A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, Nathan Thrall.